estate. So there's no estate tax. Section 4, Congress shall not initiate a value-added tax or national sales tax or any other tax in kind or form. Section 5, this amendment shall take effect on the 4th fiscal year after its ratification. An amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy. Section 1, all federal departments and agencies shall expire if said departments and agencies are not individual reauthorized in standalone reauthorization bills every 3 years by a majority of vote of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So every 3 years, any of these agencies are up for revote whether we're going to approve them or not. Section 2, all executive branch regulations exceeding an economic burden of $100 million as determined jointly by the Government Accountability Office and the Congressional Budget Office shall be submitted to a permanent joint committee of Congress, thereafter the Congressional Delegation Oversight Committee, for review and approval prior to their implementation. Section 3, the committee shall consist of 7 members of the House of Representatives, 4 chosen by the Speaker and 3 chosen by the Minority Leader. The 7 members of the Senate, 4 chosen by the Majority and 3 chosen by the Minority Leader. No member shall serve on the committee beyond a single 3-year term. Section 4, the committee shall vote no later than 6 months after the date of submission of the regulation of the committee. The committee shall make no change to the regulation, either approving or disapproving the regulation by the majority vote as submitted. Section 5, if the committee does not act within 6 months after the date of the submission of the regulatory committee, the regulation shall be considered disapproved and must not be implemented by the executive branch. An amendment to promote free enterprise. Section 1, Congress's power to regulate commerce is not a plenary grant of power to the federal government to regulate and control economic activity for a specific grant of power limited to preventing states from implementing commerce and trade between and among the several states. You got that? It's important, because you know how they bastardized the Commerce Clause. Congress will no longer have the power of regulating interstate commerce among the several states. Section 2, Congress's power to regulate commerce does not extend to activity within a state, whether or not it affects interstate commerce, nor does it extend to compelling any individual or entity to participate in commerce or trade. Now, I'll be speaking in future detail of what these things mean. I just want you to become aware of them, because we are going to get a commitment from every person that's in our state legislature, in the House and the Senate, where they stand. They're all going to know these exist in this state. We got to roll up our sleeves and start working on this. I'm already working with leaders in other states, and I'm going to have a plan set forth that we can implement this in this state. An amendment to protect private property. Section 1, when any government entity acts not to secure a private property right against actions that injure property owners, but to take property for a public use from a property owner by actual seizure or through regulation, this is called the Takings Clause in the Constitution, which taking results in a market value reduction of the property interference with the use of the property or a financial loss to the property owner exceeding $10,000, the government shall compensate fully said property owner for such losses. An amendment to grant states authority to directly amend the Constitution. And this is this clause that I told you about that's never been enacted that Madison wrote into the Constitution. Section 1, the state legislatures, whenever 2/3 shall deem it necessary, may adopt amendments to the Constitution. Section 2, each state legislature adopting said amendment must adopt amendments identical in subject and wording to the other state legislatures. Section 3, a 6-year time limit is placed on the adoption of an amendment, starting from the date said amendment is adopted by the first state legislature. So that means there's 6 years for the other states to jump on board. Each state legislature adopting said amendment shall provide an exact copy of the adopted amendment, along with an affidavit signed and dated by the Speaker of the House of the state legislature to the Archivist of the United States within 15 calendar days of its adoption. So the states are now putting the federal government on notice. Within 15 days, when a state adopts a new amendment to the Constitution, and then the state must notify the other 49 states. A 6-year time limit is placed on the adoption of the amendment, starting from the date said amendment is adopted by the first state legislature. Each state legislature adopting said amendment shall provide an exact copy of the adopted amendment along with the affidavit signed and dated by the Speaker of the House and the state and the Archivist of the United States within 15 calendar days. Section 4. Upon adaptation of an amendment, a state legislature may not rescind the amendment or modify it during the 6-year period in which the amendment is under consideration by the several states' legislatures. An amendment to protect the vote. Section 1. Citizens of every state, territory, and the District of Columbia shall produce valid photographic identification documents demonstrating evidence of their citizenship issued by the state government for the state in which the voter resides as a requirement for registering to vote and voting in any primary or general election for president, vice president, or members of Congress. So this prevents, you know what's happened in states, 2 states that have overridden the federal law, particularly Pennsylvania and Arizona, about providing state legislatures identification cards. Is immediately Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton run into that state and say, well, this is a poll tax against the fofo. Now this provides for the states issuing at no expense to the person a voter ID, a pictured voter ID. Section 2, provisions shall be made by the state legislature to provide each citizen designated photographic identification documents at no cost to the individuals unable to afford fees associated with acquiring such documents. Section 3, early voting in any general election for president, vice president, members of Congress shall not be held more than 30 calendar days prior to the national day of elections except for active duty military person for whom early voting shall not commence more than 45 days prior to the national day of election. Section 4, where registration and or voting is not in person but by mail, citizens must submit an approved citizen-designated photo ID and other reliable information to the state elections officers to register to vote and request ballots for voting no later than 45 calendar days before the primary or general elections for president, vice president, members of Congress. Legislation forms and ballots must be returned and signed by the vote and must either be mailed or hand-delivered by the voter or state election officer. If delivered by a third party, the voter must provide written authorization for the person making the delivery, and the third party must sign a statement certifying that he did not duly influence the voter's decision. Section 5, electronic or other technically based voting systems for purpose of registering or voting in national elections are prescribed unless a reliable identification card or secure voting regimen is established by the state legislature. In my opinion, this needs to, the electronic voting needs to go. We can't have three companies programming those. So I'm going to propose amendments to this. I'm going to write it with Mark Adams and consult with him about changing that so that we can have democratic elections that are counted in public and openly seen in public. Any election, local, state, federal. So that covers the amendments. I'll give you more what the founders said on each one of these in future elections. I'm going to need a couple secretaries to work with other states and people in those states to implement that and to come up with a way to find what each member of our Florida State House of Representatives and Senate, where do they stand on these? We want to know. We're going to bug them until we know where they stand on them. And we're going to make that public to the voters of this state. Thank you very much for your time.
Folks, we're going to take a quick break. Coffee and stuff's in there. Please be back in about 5-6 minutes. We've got a special treat for about 3 minutes before our main speaker comes on. And you're not going to want to miss it, so if you need to take a party break or whatever,